All right, here's the video.
Why you shouldn't front squat. Blake front squats 315 pounds, and that generates 2,800 newtons of maximum force. Then he back squats 315, the same amount of weight, and generates 3,300 newtons of maximum force. And when he does 385 pounds, he generates almost 3,400 newtons of force. You generate a lot more force when you back squat compared to front squat because you can add more mass to the bar. And most of the time, people accelerate better with the back squat compared to the front squat.
All right, let's talk about this. And whenever I talk about these things, I think this is really cool, actually. There's no hate. But I can lend some advice here because I have force plates right there. And I've worked very heavily and closely with force plates. And so I want to share you my bit of insight regarding this topic. But before I say that at all, really cool that 804 Sports Performance is using force plates to try and better understand training. Big round of applause for it. Very cool. I love this in the field of performance. People being their own unique sports scientists and trying to uncover aspects of movement that might benefit them and their athletes. But I responded to this, and I'll even dive into my response a little bit more. In short, if max force was the goal in any squat pattern, assuming all squat patterns are working the same muscles. That's a big assumption we'll get to in a second because we talk about the front squat versus the back squat. Are they really the same exercise? If we assume that all squats are the same, the best way to produce maximal force would be to do a squat pattern that represents an isokinetic-like device. An isokinetic device, if you imagine a bar on a machine and it pushes you down and then you lift it back up, think about like one of those car mashers or a trash compactor. It's basically what an isokinetic device does. Kinetic means speed, iso means same. It goes down at one speed, comes up at the other speed, and the whole time you're resisting it and then pressing against it. Why would that machine exist? Good question. Well, at every joint range of motion, your strength differs. So at certain joint ranges, you're really strong. At certain ones, you're weaker. That's why at the top of pull-up, it's really hard. Maybe the bottom is easier. Pick an exercise, you can find out that it has a strength curve. The most amount of weight you can lift in any exercise is limited by the strongest weak point of a movement, your sticking point. Your sticking point is the weakest range of motion in that movement. So I might get stuck on a bench press right here at 300 pounds, but maybe I could have pressed 330 right here or 330 off the chest. So I'm limited by load on that sticking point. So what this tells us is that there are different strength profiles or strength outputs per range of motion. And if I just wanted to optimize force output, something that allows me to reach my maximal force at all those angles would be the perfect exercise. So the idea behind an isokinetic device is that you're pressing your hardest against this machine, down and back up, and you're doing the maximal effort at joint angle, regardless of the strength profile. Now, you might not have a device with you, so here's my solution. A hand-supported back squat with a safety bar. I'm sure you've seen these before. Dr. Fred Hatfield made these most famous, well, he's maybe one of the most famous squatters, and made this exercise extremely popular. Put your hands on something in front of you, you have a safety bar on your back, you squat down with a weight that is more than what you probably could lift with a barbell, and you go down, and at certain points of times you might meet a weak spot. Let's say you have 600 pounds on the bar, you go down, the initial range of motion, you can handle it just fine, but then we get right here at the bottom position of a squat, and we're kind of weak. We can use our hands to add a little bit of support to match that, 600-pound need, and we can continue to lift it. So I'm going back up, add my hands, take off my hands, back up. So we're adding assistance where assistance is needed. So if maximal force was the goal, that's the exercise we would pick. The second thing with this potential issue is the force time characteristics. So when I stand on a force plate, it measures force over a period of time. What are we looking at? Are we looking at peak force? What's the highest peak force? Are we looking at total force over an entire range of motion? Are we looking at force represented over a certain period of time, maybe the initial burst? Depending on your goal, you're going to have different analysis and each analysis, time interval is going to have different significance. So if I'm using a force plate and I go down and I squat and I just take peak force, for example, that might not tell the whole story. This post doesn't say which one we're looking at. If I had to guess, it'd be peak force. If I had to guess. Doesn't matter. The point is, peak force is one type of response. Really high peak forces would actually be occurred in faster lowering movements, maybe even lighter weights. I've demonstrated that before on here. That sometimes really heavy weights limit the amount of peak force you can even produce because you run into what is called an elastic versus dissipative profile. A really simple example to explain elastic versus dissipative. What are you talking about, Max? Imagine you're jumping off of a box and you land and you spring back up as high as you can and jump and touch something. You jump off the box, hit the ground, bounce back up. Sometimes that impact is augmentative. It helps your performance. You jump up. Elastic. But if you jump off a really high box, you're just worried about landing and you dissipate the forces. Think about like a parkour athlete. That's why a parkour athlete tumbles and rolls while a high jumper sprints as fast as they can and they spring back up off the ground. So the type of force you're looking at really matters, and that dictates the kind of adaptations you're striving for. Lastly, there's something called inverse dynamics, and if we want to actually know what muscles are being loaded biomechanically, we can't just look at the force on a force plate. We have to understand joint angles and joint moments. And so what they do in a research lab is they'll have a force plate, but they'll integrate that with motion capture, 3D motion analysis. So you measure how far joint angle is maybe when you squat down and come back up relative to the vector of load on the body. And then you can measure the torque, which is like the rotational force demands placed on the joint. And you can say, oh, well, I know the quadricep causes knee extension. There's a large rotational torque at the knee on a front squat, so it's loading the quadriceps more. You can mathematically prove it. And then people will use things like EMG, electromyography, needles or pads in the legs to see the amount of electrical activity in certain muscles, because not just one muscle works the knee joint. There might be 4 muscles that work extension in the knee joint, the quadriceps, 4 muscles. They might distinguish which specific musculature is responsible for that kind of knee extension during that movement, because inverse dynamics is still a macro analysis. You have the ground reaction forces from the force plate, you have the joint angles, but now let's dive into and look at what muscles are actually causing these joints to create rotation. Now that we've determined, the muscle group that acts upon that joint, because we're looking at a joint, we can then dive into the specific musculature. So you're going to need some sort of inverse dynamic aspect of analysis to figure that one out. So I don't think the back squat is the same as the front squat. I think they work different muscles, and how you do the movement, any movement changes the muscles. You can do a back squat that's more quad dominant versus more hip dominant. And this is why it's really important to understand not just the ground reaction forces, but the moments at the joints when you perform any exercise, because that's going to dictate the load on the muscles, essentially, because if you have certain torque at the knee, you're going to have certain torque or demands placed on the quads to create knee extension. So not all back squats are even made the same. And how you perform that movement is going to dictate what muscles are loaded. So, should we front squat? Should we back squat? Is the back squat superior because it produces more force? The answer is no. Simply not. If the goal was maximal force and we have that assumption model, maybe the hand-supported squat would be the best. Or actually, if we really want to dive further into it, this opens a whole can of worms as to maybe actually a machine is better than a barbell squat because of the lack of stability demands, and if you have less stability demands, you can produce more force, and force is what acts upon the muscles to create tension and strain, which leads to adaptation, right? It's a strain-based adaptive process on the muscles. Maybe that's the best way, not for here for this conversation. So that's my 2 cents on this video and why it's important to understand the full picture, but why it's really cool also that you're beginning to investigate this kind of stuff, so all kudos to him diving into it, because these are, I don't even want to call them mistakes. These are things you begin to learn as you dive into something new. Nothing's ever going to be perfect in terms of your first analysis or many analyses later. It's just, the more you learn about this stuff, the more you realize there's a lot to unravel. And that's a great starting point, is to just pop on the force plate, measure stuff, and see what happens, and then begin to try and figure out why it's happening and double check your hypothesis as to whether or not it's correct. So I appreciate you guys listening. Hope you enjoyed, and take care.